Thank you, Rosemary. To begin with, I express my deepest appreciation to the Pirates Alley Faulkner Society and, of course, to Rosemary James and Joe DeSalvo this opportunity. We're in one of the oldest and most historic neighborhoods in this country. It owes its history and its famous cachet not merely as a long-time political and economic center of a territory and a state, but to its first European discoverers and subsequent rediscoverers. Iberville, so to speak, begat George Washington Cable, who begat, in a left-handed way, Grace King, and on a Saxon, Faulkner and Williams. That craggy family tree, in turn, gave rise to yet more generations of writers and interpreters. I am not so parochial to suggest that New Orleans ever had a monopoly on literature wrung from the old haunts. Localism in writing is a worldwide movement, among those perceptive enough and brave enough to write about their hometowns. Yet this city and its famous enclaves have been in the forefront of literary localism. My friend, author, and poet James Nolan has said, 3 ingredients are essential for bohemian culture to take root and flourish: creative misfits, magic, and cheap rent. The Vieux Carré, and later the Faubourg Marigny, had this cultural cocktail at different times. The Vieux Carré had its Faulkner and Spratling shooting windows with a pellet gun. The Marigny, about 50 years later, had its gay carnival costume and float makers. The Quarter for many years had cheap rent, and later the Marigny became a less costly alternative to its older sister. With all respect to my friend, I think that the misfits and cheap rent, once poured in the glass, swirl in layers to make the heady libation of magic, one worth remembering in poems, prose, and art. What are the cultural characteristics of historic neighborhoods? What makes them special and memorable? They're old by comparison to human lifespans. The streets must have a life of their own, not just a collection of houses. There must be an enduring sense of community. There must be long-time residents as keepers of folklore and tradition. Old neighborhoods, like high mountains or the ocean, can impart a comforting sense of personal obscurity and therefore freedom. This freedom from most conventional expectations and mores can lead to the discovery of those prevailing in the neighborhood at hand. Like maiden aunts too old to be shocked or judgmental, these neighborhoods indulgently hosted the dreamers and the doers, and some of these doers were writers. By candles, the moon, or gas lamps, the grand themes of mainstream literature paled by comparison to the soap bubble realities of the New Orleans here and now. The verities discovered in saloons, the wit of the salons, and the everyday wisdom of the street became the material for so many stories, novels, and motion pictures. What motivates the recorders of these things? In large part is the ephemeral nature of these glittering soap bubbles, the reality that can emerge from friends drinking an evening away, the bon mot uttered by the keeper of a salon, the passing remarks of stoop-front scavengers, a drifting young person, or a celebrated eccentric like Ruthie the Duck Lady. Who is to remember and record these things, if not a writer who can reach for an Underwood or an iPad before boozy consciousness gives way to sleep? Who is to put in poetry the echo of a just-ended song? By casting these soap bubbles, these dancing dust motes caught in a shaft of light, into words, they can be captured in an impressionistic way for future generations. In New Orleans, Cleo, Muse of history, rides in a United cab, which not coincidentally brought me over here this morning. In the backseat with her are people of both profound insight and profound decadence, yet she learns from them all. The historian is not the only type of writer who learns from the old neighborhoods. The novelist and the poet find ample makings, ample enough to rearrange, to synthesize, into something new and yet true to the spirit of the cradle of inspiration. Along with an appreciation for a rollicking present, a writer in such a neighborhood should feel the press of time. Until Hurricane Katrina, the glacial pace of change here fooled many people, myself included, into thinking that few things would ever change. Yet change did come, and it was not slow, nor did it spare the historic enclaves. The openness to new ideas, the awareness of the sands of time, must be accompanied by genuine affection and compassion for people who bring the streetscape alive. To paraphrase St. Paul, though we speak with the tongues of the Garden District and Chalmette, and have not respect for our subjects, we become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. It is doubtful that our New Orleans descendants will find cheap rent anymore. Society is now less tolerant of bohemians without the legitimacy that great wealth bestows. But the next poor drifting misfits may well find inspiration in the recollection of quarter and Marigny writers past, and hopefully create their own bit of magic. I'm going to recite a short poem now that I wrote walking from the Marigny to Bywater one night in 1998, and listening to the bells of the various churches down there sound late at night. Endless Dauphine Street. The sun's last parade tints each house a different shade, and bright colors fade like the people that you meet on an endless Dauphine Street. Past dark spires teetering on the brink of living memory, but still tolling their hours for someone, maybe me. The gong hums on and then is gone, like the people that you meet on an endless Dauphine Street. I leave only shadow in my draft. My story walks on with me. Who is the quick, who is the dead? And time runs fore and aft with each heavy-booted tread. I'm one of those people that you meet on endless Dauphine Street. Thank you.
Do we have questions?
Yes, please.
I was starting to write down notes when you mentioned your art, the literary heritage. You mentioned 3 ingredients before you talked about the monopoly on writers. So what were the 3 ingredients?
Sure. Misfits, cheap rent, and magic.
So, and who were the writers? Who was the literary heritage of New Orleans? You mentioned that just briefly.
Well, I mentioned it at a very, very superficial level because we could talk about this for days. I mentioned Faulkner and William Spratling, who was his roommate. Spratling was something of a writer. He's better known as the silversmith.
Yeah.
And Faulkner and Spratling shot pellet guns out of their windows at people out on the street in the 1920s.
Especially nuns.
Yeah, especially nuns, and drank moonshine that Faulkner had brought over from Mississippi. The earlier people, of course, were George Washington Cable, who upset some of the myths of the French Creoles, talked a little too realistically, did a little bit too much of truth-telling, and was pretty much run out of New Orleans and had to take refuge in New York. And when I say he begat in a left-handed way Grace King appointed herself and was regarded as the defender of French Creole traditions, particularly their fantasy, which it was, of a strictly monoracial white heritage. While Saxon, of course, is well known, he talked very explicitly about multiracial and multicultural families. He was one of the movers and shakers of the revival of the French Quarter in the early 1900s, 1920s. Faulkner, of course, here we are, and Tennessee Williams. And the fact is that this is a very rich literary ground, and I myself consider I've scratched the ground with a stick. I certainly have not plowed it as deeply as any of these famous people. Yes.
What was the most interesting or surprising fact that you learned in the research for your most recent book on the Faulkner family?
Well, I wanted to research the myths about Bernard De Marigny, and there were two, there are many legends. The man was a legend in his own time and heard these legends. The first legend was he gambled the family fortune away, and that's why he had to subdivide the plantation in order to recoup his money. That's patently false. He had plenty of money both before and after the subdivision of what we now call the Faulkner. He had plenty of money. In fact, he had, in 1835, his personal wealth was valued at just under $1 million in money at the time. I can't do the calculation to tell you how much that'd be worth today. It would be a bunch. Not to mention the land he owned and, of course, the human slaves he owned across 4 parishes. The second myth was that he died in poverty. That's also not true. When he died in 1868, it's true he was living in reduced circumstances. He was living at the corner of Royal and Frenchman, used to sit out on the sidewalk in his cashmere dressing gown at a little table because the light inside was really bad for his old eyes. But when he died, he had $15,000 in the bank. That's not a shabby amount of money today to have in your checking account, and it certainly was pretty good in 1868. Furthermore, in his safe deposit or strong box, he had several IOUs. So he was pretty secure in his money to loan people money. Those are the two main surprising facts I guess I encountered. Also tracing the history of the revival. I don't want to call it gentrification because it doesn't really fit. And gentrification, unfortunately, has become a dirty word. But the revival of the Marigny in the early 70s, I was privileged to interview Eugene Sizik and his partner, Lloyd Sensat. They had been the vanguard of this, and many of you know that Gene teaches a course in preservation at the master's level, and I think it's actually the doctorate level, and he's still going. I just saw him
Still lives in
two
the
days
Marigny.
ago. Yes, ma'am.
I know,
Yes.
I've talked to him very recently.
Yeah, I saw him 2 days ago. Yes, please.
I was wondering, when I think of wonderful writers about New Orleans, Kate Chopin and Walker Percy stand in an interesting relation to the kind of writers. I know Kate Chopin was not read because she was categorized as a local colorist until the more contemporary revival of the Awakening. But I just wonder how you would talk about that tension, the difference, because they are offset, really. They write about New Orleans, but, Percy goes on at length about why he lives where he lives as much as he loves New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Kate Chopin stages a kind of Presbyterian or Catholic conflict in
Yeah.
French Catholic conflict. And it's interesting because the city is so, represented in such detail and such in many inviting ways as a literary subject, but they're not on your list.
Well, they weren't on my list because, of course, I didn't want to. The points you're making are excellent. In a talk like this, again, this is kind of a superficial 30,000-foot level of writers and their lineage. I'm not an expert on either one of them. I have read both of them, not extensively. I will say generically, I'm a little more familiar with Percy. I have read The Awakening.
I think they're kind of, it's good that they're not on your list. In other words, there's sort of a difference.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
what
they
I
didn't
was
fit
thinking.
into the Faubourg Marigny.
Yeah,
No, that's true.
The French Quarter and Faubourg Marigny are not.
But looking to the wider topic of my talk here this morning, I would say that a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with New Orleans. I love New Orleans. It's not an uncritical love. It's not an unconditional love like a dog for its master. There are things about New Orleans that drive me absolutely nuts, but I still love New Orleans and return and have been here in one capacity or another for 36 years. I can only say that some friends of mine, some dear friends of mine who have since moved away, they come back as often as they can, but for various circumstances, economics and sheer age, they prefer a bit of a distance. And that to them, they believe that's healthy for everybody. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am, you had a question?
I was just thinking about place and about, I know this is, Dixie's Bar of Music was on Bourbon Street in the French Quarter, and I know it was a great gathering place for musicians of all stripes. How about writers? Did you find anything about that, or find any evidence of writers also frequenting that particular place?
Not essentially. Dixie's was well known as one of the gay bars that had pretty much immunity from the police, because Dixie knew everybody, and she was a close friend, for instance, of Clay Shaw, who in his prime here was very influential, very tied to the political establishment. I did not really find that per se about Dixie's. There are other bars that have attracted writers here, but Dixie's, that may be true, I simply don't know.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you.
I want to point out that